Hello everybody and welcome to another One History Help video with me, Mrs. O'Neill. As you can see, this video is all about the League of Nations during the 1920s, and it's the perfect video to watch after you have seen the video that I have done on the introduction to the League of Nations, where I talk through the weaknesses of the League and I talk through how the League was set up. And that's going to be important because the events of the 1920s is where we're going to start to see some of those weaknesses start to play out. We're going to start to understand why it was the League of Nations was such a failure. Here's a rough overview of how we're going to be having a look at this. So rather than looking at one event at a time chronologically, what this video does is it separates the events of the 1920s into success and failures for the League of Nations. We're going to go through the successes first of all, and then the failures. And you'll notice when we go through the failures, we're also going to go through that event of to do with Bulgaria in 1925, which kind of fits in a little bit with success and a bit of failure as well. One of the key things to be aware of, however, is that the 1920s was a decade where lots of international agreements were being made that also did not involve the League of Nations at all. And we're going to look at two of those, the Locano treaties and the Kleogbriand Pact, because they're quite significant, yet they had absolutely nothing to do with the League of Nations, despite the fact that Britain and France, the leaders of the League, were involved in those treaties. So like I said, we're going to go through the successes first, then we're going to go through the failures, and it's within the failures that we're going to talk about Bulgaria, and then we're going to go through those two other treaties, the most significant ones from the 1920s that had nothing to do with the League of Nations at all. So first of all, in terms of a success for the League of Nations was the Åland Islands, and that happened in the year of 1921. And the map that's on the screen just here gives you a rough idea of where we're referring to. So we're having a look at Europe and we're having a look at some islands, yes, those tiny ones in that red circle there that are between Sweden and Finland. So both Sweden and Finland wanted control of the Åland Islands, and as you can see, they're roughly midway between the two countries. And it got to the point where these two countries were so kind of at loggerheads about who should be able to have the Åland Islands that there was even the threat of fighting breaking out over them. So what they did was, what everybody should have been doing in the 1920s, is appealing to the League of Nations. This is what the League was built for. When countries were having disputes, rather than trying to deal with things violently between them, they went to the League and asked them for a decision about what should happen, rather than that fighting breaking out. And after studying the matter closely, the League decided that the Åland Islands should go to Finland. Okay, and Finland is the country just on the right, Sweden is on the left. And essentially, Sweden, although obviously losing out on the Åland Islands, accepted this decision and war was completely avoided. So as we can see here, an event that was completely successful for the League of Nations, two nations that were on the brink of war, but thanks to the League intervening, we are able to avoid that conflict and the League's decision was accepted as well. Another success which took place for the League of Nations in 1921 was an event regarding Upper Silesia. And as you can see from the map that's drawn out just at the bottom here, Upper Silesia is a district between Germany and Poland. Technically speaking, in 1921, Upper Silesia belonged to Poland after it was taken away from Germany as part of the land restrictions, the German territories that were lost under the Treaty of Versailles. Upper Silesia, because of where it is, was inhabited by both German and Polish people. And so because of this, Germany and Poland both wanted control of this location. Also, another reason why these two countries had a bit of a vested interest in wanting to control Upper Silesia was because it had a really rich iron and steel industry. That kind of raw material industry is going to be really important for nations trying to rebuild themselves in the aftermath of the First World War. The decision was made that a plebiscite would be held in Upper Silesia, where the people in Upper Silesia would vote about which country they wanted to join. So the vote would say, do you want to be part of Poland or do you want to be part of Germany? And what happened was a kind of very fortunate split, really. The industrial areas of Upper Silesia voted to go back to Germany, whereas the rural areas, the areas for agriculture, very much voted in favour of being part of Poland. So what the League of Nations did, therefore, was they divided the area of Upper Silesia along those lines. And the industrial areas went to Germany and the rural areas went to Poland. Luckily, very, very luckily, it was really literally a case of dividing it down the middle, and the left part went to Germany and the right part went to Poland. And they also made sure, the League also put in place certain rules to make sure that there wouldn't be any problems in Upper Silesia in the future, including, for instance, decent transport links between the two different sides. And a success for the League of Nations because both of these two countries accepted the decision that the League came up with, and they respected the plebiscite outcome as well. So yes, we're not really swimming in successes for the League of Nations in the 1920s, but when we look at the Åland Islands and Upper Silesia as events together, the question is, what do they have in common with each other? So why is it that these two events have a successful outcome? Essentially, we can talk about the fact that the decision that the League of Nations reached was respected and agreed upon by all nations involved, be that Sweden and Finland for Åland Islands or Germany and Poland for Upper Silesia. Everybody agreed with the result and the decision that the League of Nations came up with. More importantly for Upper Silesia is the fact that a plebiscite was held meant that it was the people who were having their say in terms of what should be happening in that location. Now, plebiscites aren't a very common part of our study of the League of Nations, but any of you who have gone on to study the causes of the Second World War will know that plebiscites are very, very handy for leaders to use because it allows them to demonstrate that democracy has been used for a decision to be reached. So rather than a decision that is forced upon the people, it is the people themselves who make those decisions. So not many successes for the League of Nations during the 1920s, but essentially they also involved, in terms of what's common with they have in common with each other, essentially we are looking at nations that really were not that strong in the early 1920s as well, and really needed to keep the League of Nations on side so they could use them for help in the future. As I mentioned earlier, we're not going through the events of the 1920s in chronological order. Instead, we're separating them into success and failures. We've dealt with the successes, now we're going to start with the failures. And this event, which takes place in Vilna in 1920, is technically speaking the first event that the League of Nations has to deal with. If you just take a look at the map just below it, you'll notice that the city of Vilna is now known as Vilnius. Okay, so it is known as something different nowadays, okay, but it's still within the same place in the country of Lithuania. So what was going on in this location that meant the League got involved? Poland and Lithuania were two new states created by the post-war treaties, so following on from World War II. And Vilna was made the capital of Lithuania, but its population was largely Polish. Now, one thing I'm just going to really quickly mention here, this is not to say that the countries of Poland and Lithuania never ever existed before. In fact, quite the opposite. Okay, Poland and Lithuania have histories going way back into the early medieval period. But over the centuries, their land has been divided up and given to other nations. At one point, Poland and Lithuania had a huge territory that they united together on. And for several centuries leading up to the First World War, these two countries saw their land disappear when we see the creation of the state of Russia really developing in the late 1600s and early 1700s. So this is why we talk to them about being newly created states. But let's be very clear, these are two countries that did exist for centuries beforehand and also have a linked history as well. So this is why when these two new countries are created following on from World War I, we get a city that is placed in a new country, technically, that has a population that is largely seen in a different country. So Vilna at the time, is the capital of Lithuania, but its population was largely Polish. Now, because of this, in 1920, a private Polish army, so not the national Polish army, but a private Polish army took control of it. And Lithuania did what all countries would do in this situation, with the League of Nations just being established. They looked to the League for help. They appealed to the League of Nations for help. And what the League did was the League essentially protested, i.e. morally condemned Poland for what it was doing, but the Polish private army did not withdraw its troops. Now, technically speaking, at this stage, this is the point where Britain and France should have sent its own soldiers over to force the Poles out of Vilna, but they didn't. Okay, but they did not do this. France didn't do this because they really wanted to keep Poland on side, because they saw them as a potential ally against Germany in the future. Remember, at this time, France is completely consumed with this idea of keeping Germany in its place following the Treaty of Versailles. So any assistance they can get in that, the better. On top of that, Britain was very much not prepared to act alone against Poland in Lithuania at this stage. If France wasn't going to do anything, Britain wasn't prepared to act as well. Another little bit of historical context here is that in 1920, Britain's armed forces were actually a little bit busy fighting and being involved in the civil war that had broken out in Ireland at this time as well. So they didn't really have troops to spare. So ultimately, in the end, the League of Nations did absolutely nothing about the Polish invasion of Lithuania into Vilna itself. And the outcome was that the Polish people were able to keep Vilna as their city. So a time when really the Polish army should have been forced out of the city of Vilna, and they weren't. They weren't forced out at all because the League of Nations, Britain and France, could not be bothered to do anything about it. They had their own selfish interests at heart. The invasion of the island of Corfu in 1923 is quite a big event from the 1920s, and it involves Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy. And if you've finished your study of the League of Nations, you will know that Mussolini is quite a key part of the League's failings in the 1930s as well, with the Abyssinian crisis. But what we're going to be focusing on today, like I said in this video, is the events of the 1920s. This is the first time we really hear about Mussolini, and for him himself, 1923, to put that in the context of Italian history, this is around the time when he is just coming into power. He is appointed the Prime Minister of Italy in 1922. So this is kind of early stages of his power. So what happens? On the 27th of August, a group of Italian ambassadors were killed on the island of Corfu. And Mussolini is understandably furious about this, and he blamed the Greek government for the murder of these ambassadors. And what Mussolini wanted was compensation to be paid to Italy and for those murderers to be executed. But the problem is that the Greek government had no idea who these murderers were. So on the 31st of August, when nothing is done, Mussolini occupied the island of Corfu. By that I mean he has troops landing on that island. And so Greece does what any nation would do with the League of Nations, who are designed to solve problems like this, is they go to the League for help. Now the problem is that Italy is one of the 4 permanent members of the Council of the League of Nations. Remember, the Council is like the VIP club of the League of Nations. So they've got a problem here. Okay, it's one thing if one of the smaller countries does something wrong. How are they going to act when a large, important country in the League does something wrong? So it took a little bit of time, but a couple of days later, by the 7th of September, the council had decided it would morally condemn what Mussolini had done. Kind of said to Mussolini, no, you really shouldn't have invaded the island of Corfu. And the suggestion that the League of Nations comes up with is that Greece has to pay the compensation that Mussolini has demanded. However, the money doesn't go to Mussolini, it goes to the League, and the League would hold on to that money until those murderers were found. And once the murderers were found, the money would be passed on to Mussolini. Now, Greece had agreed to these terms. However, Mussolini didn't like it at all. So although on the surface he accepted the League's decision, behind the scenes he goes around and changes the League's ruling and deals with the leaders of Greece directly. And what he does is he forces the Greeks to apologise for the murder of these Italian ambassadors, and he also makes them pay the money directly to Mussolini, not giving it to the League of Nations, paying it directly to them. And the Greeks kind of are forced into agreeing to this. Okay, despite the fact that on the surface the League is saying, oh yes, we did a really good job of that, behind the scenes Mussolini is using his bullying and intimidating personality to get his own way. So that is why it changes. And then when it comes through on the 27th of September, Mussolini takes his troops off of Corfu, boasting that he has done a tremendous job. Okay, sounds very, very, very much like an American president as well, about just like how he would potentially have reacted to this situation. Now I'm going to talk about Bulgaria here. Okay, now as I mentioned earlier, Bulgaria has a few moments of success, but also has some moments of failure as well. Have a look at the map so you know geographically where it is that we are talking about. Just over to the left hand side of that map there, you can see the heel of the boot of Italy. And as you can see, Greece, who has just kind of found the foul end of the League of Nations, if you will, in 1923 with Corfu, is going to be involved as well. So here's what happens. In October 1925, the Greek troops invade Bulgaria after an incident on the border in which some Greek soldiers were killed. Okay? An invasion is an act of aggression, and therefore the League of Nations should be getting involved. And so that's exactly what Bulgaria does. Bulgaria goes to the League of Nations and asks for help. And what the League does is it morally condemns the Greek actions, and they order Greece to pull their forces out of Bulgaria and pay Bulgaria compensation. Now, because Greece at this time, much like how we've seen with Sweden and Finland and Poland as well, because Greece is a relatively weak nation at this time, they're kind of forced to go along with what the League of Nations says, okay, because they can't really risk falling out of favour with the larger nations who could potentially protect them. So they do as they're told, but they're not happy about it because they look back on what happened at Corfu, and Greece is rightly now thinking that there seems to be one rule for the larger, more powerful countries like Italy and another rule for the smaller and weaker countries like Greece. They're starting to notice that certain countries are getting this preferential treatment. There's an element of favouritism going on here. So while we can say Bulgaria is a success because essentially the conflict is avoided and Greece does exactly what the League says, but there's a failing in it because countries are starting to see here that actually the League of Nations only really works if you are in that VIP club of the Council of the League. If you're not, then essentially you're left to fend for yourself. A final failure that we're going to take a look at before we move on to look at those events that are involved outside of the League of Nations is the Disarmament Conference of 1926. Now let's remember that disarmament is one of the main aims of the League of Nations. If we remember that acronym of SIDE, it is what the D in SIDE stands for, disarmament. So one of the League's aims is for countries to work towards this idea of reducing the size of their armed forces. If armies are smaller, then countries are not going to be feeling confident enough to fight. So in 1926, a commission was set up to explore the possibility for the reduction of army size for its member countries. And Britain and France kind of realised that as the leaders of the League of Nations, they would be responsible for checking up on all of the countries to make sure they were doing exactly as they were told. Britain actually fears that this is a responsibility that could take up quite a lot of time. So what they do at the Disarmament Conference is they overturn any decisions. And the technical term we give to that is that they veto. They veto any decisions that are made. So because Britain essentially can't be bothered to check up on all of these countries, disarmament doesn't go ahead. It is abandoned until it is looked at again in the early 1930s. And when that happens, it's abandoned again then as well. So disarmament was a key aim of the League of Nations, and the first time they come to talk about it, it falls through completely, all because of the selfish interests of Britain in particular. So when we look at all of these failings together, what do we notice? What do we notice is coming through a lot? What do they have in common with each other? There's a lot of selfish interest from Britain and France. Britain and France very much act as leaders of the League of Nations when it suits them, and the way that they act will be based on what they need at that time. We also see, especially with the situation with Greece, Corfu, Italy and Bulgaria, this concept of favouritism, of preferential treatment going on here. This idea that those bigger nations involved in that VIP Council of the League tend to get better treatment than those smaller and weaker nations that are not involved, like Greece, like Bulgaria, for instance. So those are two big failings of the League of Nations that we see in the 1920s. And a lot of historians argue that a lot of these failings could have been avoided had the League had an army to back themselves up with when countries went against their rulings. But as we know, as a peacekeeping force, the League of Nations did not have an army of its own. Now we're going to take a look at the two key events that happened in the 1920s that had nothing to do with the League of Nations whatsoever. The first of which we're going to have a look at is the Locano treaties, which take place in 1925. The Locano treaties were signed by Britain, Belgium, France, Germany and Italy. And the agreement in the Locano treaties was that the boundaries that were set out in the Treaty of Versailles would be accepted and agreed upon. And for Germany, it was a positive for them because it meant that the French couldn't occupy the Ruhr again like it had done in 1923. And in return, Germany promised that the Rhineland would stay demilitarized. Okay. Now, again, those of you who've gone on to study the causes of World War II will know that that changes in 1936 when Hitler invades the Rhineland. Okay. But in 1925, when the Locano Treaty is signed, that is what Germany agrees to. Because of Germany's involvement in the Locano treaties, and at this stage we have Gustav Stresemann involved as the leader of Germany, because they clearly are demonstrating that they have shown that they are responsible despite all that had happened following on from the First World War, Germany was allowed to be invited into the League of Nations, and that happens in 1926. And Germany on that day promises that they will solve any possible disputes through the League of Nations. Now, something that we just need to kind of cast out there, again, for those of you who are going on to study the causes of World War II, is that the Locano treaties, when they're talking about the boundaries set out in the Treaty of Versailles, they were very much concerned with those boundaries in Western Europe. So we're talking about boundaries, for instance, with France. Nothing, however, is mentioned about the boundaries in the east of Europe, in particular Germany's border with Poland. Now that's going to be really, really important, again, for those of you who go on to study the causes of World War II, when we take a look at what happens in terms of the Nazi-Soviet Pact and the German invasion of Poland in September 1939. The other key event that we need to be aware of that did not involve the League of Nations at all in the 1920s is the Kleogbriand Pact, which happens in the later 1920s in 1928. Now, over 60 countries were involved in signing the Kleogbriand Pact, and that included Germany, where they would agree not to use war against each other in the future. So only diplomacy, only talking through problems would be used to try and solve any disputes. The only time, they said, that war would be allowed if it was in a time of self-defense. That was their kind of loophole to this agreement. Nothing was said in the pact about what happened if a country did not keep to the terms of the agreement. And that's really important because you need to do that. When you're going to make an agreement like that, you need to have it set out what will happen if somebody breaks that pact. But that was not set out in the Kleogbriand Pact. America plays a significant role in the organising and the signing of the Kleogbriand Pact, and because of that, the pact is still very much in force today as well, and also because it was done outside of the League of Nations. So this is a really significant moment, as are the Locano treaties as well, but despite the fact that Britain and France are involved, the League of Nations are not, and this only adds to the failings of the League of Nations during the 1920s. As I mentioned before, I've gone through the events of the 1920s with you, not in chronological order, but dividing it into success, failures, and those events which happened outside of the League of Nations. However, I did want to refer to you about the chronology, okay? And again, if you want to take a screenshot of what we've got here, you may well find this useful to refer to a little bit later on, and it's all been colour-coded accordingly. One thing that I haven't mentioned specifically as an event is in 1926, where Germany joins the League of Nations, but I have put that there as a success for the League because the more countries that are in the League, the better. The League only works if countries are going to be within it and agree to abide by its rules. So I've just added that onto there. So you might find it useful to take a look at this. As you will see, not a lot of success to really kind of be writing home about. For instance, if you're asked to compare the failings and the successes of the League in the 1920s, we'll notice that although they do have success early on, they're not particularly that big a deal compared to failures that they deal with, and definitely not compared to those bigger events like the Locano treaties and the Kleogbriand Pact, which are signed, that have nothing to do with the League of Nations at all. So that's it for my review of the 1920s League of Nations events. Hopefully you found that useful. Don't forget to like the video if you have enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so that you can get updates on when new videos are released on the channel. Feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. You'll find me there at One History Help, and you'll find me also on Facebook, again, if you search for One History Help. Thank you for your time, everybody. I look forward to seeing you again soon.